Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Pranati and I work as an associate of Belong Research Collective. And I welcome you all to the 6th day of the inaugural edition of the xSDG Unconference. The xSDG Unconference is an initiative of Belong. A little bit about Belong for more context. Belong is a social innovation platform that seeks to offer discrimination-free services to people who are otherwise marginalized on the basis of their identity, such as caste, gender, ethnicity, disability, etc. And essentially, we run programs in 3 verticals: the Research Collective, of which this unconference is a part of, the Mental Health Collective, and the Literature Collective. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. The Unconference is a part of one of our most major initiatives at Belong right now, which is called xSDG, in which X stands for intersectionality, which is a global platform to promote truly intersectional and inclusive development. At xSDG, we've been curating resources in terms of research papers, reports, data sets that are focused on development through the lens of intersectional identities, and a whole host of other things. You can check this out at www.xsdg.dev. I'll be dropping the link in the chat box as well. We also have plans to host some podcasts around the wonderful themes that are arising out of this unconference, as well as create a space for people to join this platform in the near future. A little bit about the unconference. The unconference is being held in collaboration with organizations such as Dalberg, Breakthrough India, and our wonderful partners, JPAL South Asia. The unconference started on the 18th of August and will run up to the 31st. We have about 15 plus panels around understanding how SDG programming and funding can better address the needs of people who face prejudice due to a whole host of identity markers. The Unconference features interactive sessions with leading thinkers, doers, funders, and development experts working across SDG topics, and seeks to shape concrete initiatives that can get implemented going forward. It's bringing together wonderful panelists and speakers like you all, who are going to explore different aspects of these topics. If you wish to learn more about these different sessions as well as the schedule, I will be putting the link in the chat box below. And should you have any questions, please feel free to post them there as well. Or alternatively, you could write to us at xsdg@belong.net. I now hand it over to Urvashi, who will be moderating the session for today and will lay out the details for the same. All the best to everyone.
Thank you, Pranati, and welcome to all the participants who joined us today. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Urvashi. I'm a Senior Policy and Training Manager at JPAL South Asia, and I work on our policy work on health and a government partnership with the state government of Odisha. Thank you so much for joining this session. As Pranati mentioned, this is one of the many sessions being hosted as part of the xSDG Unconference. JPAL is hosting 5 sessions. This is the 3rd of the sessions we're hosting, and we have 2 more coming up tomorrow on inclusive policy making in SDGs, and another on Friday on inclusive MEL systems in research. So we hope that you join us for those sessions as well. To begin with, for today, a few housekeeping rules. We have a few modes through which participants can share their questions for the presenters. So in case you have any questions during the presentations, please post them in the Q&A box or in the chat. And please mention the name of the researcher or presenter you're addressing your question to. Today's session is an interesting research showcase where we've invited 10 speakers to present findings from innovative studies on identifying and mitigating prejudice in development programs. This session is being co-organized by JPAL South Asia and Ideas for India. So I wanted to thank Nalini and Michelle from the Ideas for India team who co-curated this panel with us. So today's session delves into this topic of identifying and mitigating prejudice. Identity markers such as gender, sexual orientation, race, caste, disability, faith, and age mediate individuals' access to an experience of SDG programs and services around the world. Programs in their design and intent often do not include explicit focus on the differential impacts of programs on these groups or mainstream the experience of marginalized communities. But efforts are being made by researchers to capture evidence on discrimination and differential access, as well as on strategies to mitigate these gaps in SDG programming. So today's evidence showcase will feature 10 presentations on innovative research studies that speak to this particular topic. Specifically, the speakers today will present research that has looked into identifying or quantifying prejudice and biases based on these identity markers. And we will also feature research that tests ways to mitigate these gaps. Each presenter today will have 5 minutes to present their work. We have 10 speakers in all, and so I request all of them to please keep to time so that we can get through all the interesting presentations that we have today. I know that that is a very tall ask given the breadth of your work, but we want to make sure that everybody has time to look at the wide range of work that's been done on this topic. And we hope that will lead to some interesting questions from the participants who've joined us today. So with that, we'll start with the first set of presentations we have. These focus on identifying discrimination and prejudice. And I'll quickly introduce our first speaker. This is Dr. Deepti Goyal, who is the Associate Professor at the School of Arts and Sciences and a Faculty Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Employment, both at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. Her main research areas are applied econometrics with a specialization in impact evaluation and labor economics. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Deepti Goyal.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. So since I have just 5 minutes, I'm going to jump straight in. So this is a paper I've written with Ashwini Deshpande from Ashoka University, and the title is Social Identity and Perceived Income Adequacy. Next slide, please. All right, so in this paper, we are focusing on two main questions. So the first thing that we'd like to understand is, does social identity affect an individual's notion of self-worth? In other words, is it the case that individuals who belong to lower caste groups, they feel that they're less deserving for the same effort, for example, compared to individuals from higher order social groups? Specifically in this paper, we look at caste as the marker of social identity, and we look at self-employed businesses, and we look at the self-reported amounts from these businesses that individuals say they consider to be remunerative earnings from their businesses. Right? So what we want to answer is it the case that individuals belonging to lower caste groups feel less deserving and therefore report smaller amounts to be remunerative? The second question, could you go back to the previous slide? The second question is, can policy mitigate these notions of self-worth? And here we'll specifically look at the MG-NREGA, that is the Employment Guarantee Scheme, launched by the Indian government in 2005. Next slide, please. So the method, we're going to use nationally representative data. Specifically, we're going to use the employment-unemployment surveys of 2004 and 2009. We're going to use two methods. The first one to answer if self-reported notions of what is considered remunerative is different across caste groups. To answer that question, we're going to adopt what is called a censored regression model. It's basically a maximum likelihood estimation on interval coded data. And what this method allows us to do is to look at observationally identical individuals in terms of their gender, age, their location of residence, land-owned and educational attainment, and then ask, do they report different amounts as being remunerative? The second method is what is called a triple difference estimation. Essentially here, what we're looking at is there a difference in the change over time in the amounts that are reported as remunerative between higher and lower caste groups in states where NREGA was implemented effectively versus states where it wasn't? And if we find that there is a difference, then it shows that policy can actually impact these perceptions of self-worth. Next slide, please. So what do we find? When we look at the data, we find that it is the case that individuals who belong to lower caste groups report smaller amounts to be remunerative from their self-employed businesses. So in 2009, scheduled tribes and scheduled castes report about 9 to 17% lower amounts as being remunerative compared to what is reported by upper castes. And other backward classes, OBCs, report 5 to 10% lower amounts as being remunerative. And when we look at whether NREGA had an impact on these notions of what is considered as remunerative earnings, then the answer is yes, it differentially impacted different caste groups. Specifically, it led to an improvement in the perception of OBCs as to what they considered as remunerative earnings from their self-employed businesses. Next slide, please. So what's the takeaway, the broad takeaway from this paper? We do find evidence that shows that individuals belonging to lower caste groups perceive internalized stigma, and they suffer from what is called depressed entitlement. So they're happy with less. All other things being the same, they're happy with less for the same effort and for the same skill, etc. And we also find that given this reality, it's not, everything is not hopeless. Government policy can target these notions of self-worth. And we find evidence that NREGA influenced the perceptions of remunerative income differentially across different caste groups and improved the notion of remunerative income for the OBCs. So this paper has been published in the Review of Development Economics, and I've given the link here. So if you're interested in reading this carefully, you can access the paper through the link. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deepti, for that great summary of this paper. And it's interesting to know the sort of effect that NREGA sort of has on these outcomes. So with that, I'll hand it over to our next speaker. This is Aditi Priya, who's a senior research associate at lead at Kriya University. She's also the founder of Bahujan Economists, a group meant for marginalized communities in economics in India. So with that, I'll hand it over to Aditi to take us to the next presentation.
Yeah, hello, hi. So thank you. I'll start with the presentation by thanking my co-author for the important insights that they brought from the field, which was carried out in 2016 and 17. And why it is important for me to tell you the timeline is because this issue was very much relevant before COVID came in, and it became all the more relevant during the pandemic and must not be forgotten after the pandemic. And to reflect on the pandemic and how it is interacting with the already struggling healthcare system in India, we used learning from interviews that we conducted during the pandemic and before that during the fieldwork with health staff like nurses, doctors, ASHA worker, ANM worker, and also a group which doesn't come to our mind when we say health worker, but they are very much as important as other worker, and these are ward boys, IRs, and cleaning staff. So in this article, we discuss the lack of protective equipments for health workers, the problem of overcrowding and inadequate staff in hospitals, the hierarchy in public institutions that pose a problem in infection control, and also the issues that health workers outside hospital face, like ASHA workers and ANM workers. Since there has been some discussion happening on most of the topics that we covered in the paper, except for a few, I'm going to limit the focus of the presentation on the issue of hierarchy, and I'm also going to give it a name, call it the caste practices, and also the issue of overcrowding. So next slide, please. Yeah. So the repeated government decision of cutting the public expenditure on health has led to many problems, and one of them being public infrastructure is in a very bad shape, which leads to overcrowding of patients. So if you ever go to the government hospital, it's a very common sight that you will see patients sharing the beds or patients lying on the floor. And the other consequence of this fund cut is inadequate staffing, which leads to over-reliance on the attendants who are there with the patients. And these attendants take care of a lot of things, from buying medicines from nearby pharmacies to also monitoring things which are meant for trained workers, like monitoring blood sugar level, etc. In addition to playing such important role, which they're not supposed to do, their presence also overcrowds the hospital, posing problem to the infection control and for everybody at the hospital. And this also adds to the burden of the cleaning staff. And this brings me to the point of treatment being given out to cleaning staff and their role in Indian healthcare system, which isn't talked about enough. So next slide, please. Yeah. So the data suggests that the share of Dalit workers in medical professional is very low compared to other social groups. And they are highly underrepresented as a proportion of their population. However, at the same time, their presence in cleaning staff is almost every cleaner in all the hospitals is a Dalit. And I'm presenting the quote that was said in the fieldwork that which you can read on the slides, that it is an unsaid rule that some distance has to be maintained from sweepers and they are not allowed in certain areas. Or even if the chair is vacant, it is expected that they will not sit on it. And if they have to sit, they will sit on another chair, which is meant for them. In addition, if there is a high-ranking doctor or nurses, dealing with body fluids and excreta is considered polluting and dirty, and this concept is borrowed from the casteist notion of purity and pollution. And what this means is that while it is acceptable for cleaning staff to, and it's even expected for them to help other workers with their work, no one else is supposed to provide any support to the cleaning staff. And this poses difficulty and risk to the cleaner themselves and also puts the patient at risk through two ways. First, the cleaner, they are not trained to do other tasks. They are supposed to expected to carry out medical tasks. And the cleaning work is delayed or left undone, putting everyone at risk at hospital. And this low status of cleaner in the social and institutional hierarchy, the prevalence of casteist practices, this result into outright discrimination from staff, which means that cleaners also lack the agency to even demand their legal rights, like asking for protective equipments. And this brings me to the concluding remark that hygiene and infection control at hospital require a combined effort from all the staff. But given the cleaning staff rarely receive any support from their colleague or patient's attendants, the burden of keeping the facility clean fall on them. Now, in this highly contagious environment of COVID-19, it is all the more important to do away with these caste prejudices, recognize their work, and provide them with the control, provide them with the training to control these infections, and also protective gear. And it is, in addition to this, it is all the more important that that it is recognized that the casteist notion creep into something as important as healthcare, and after recognition, there should be a work done to eradicate it. On the next slide, I have also mentioned some papers that talk about the similar issue that I've just shared, and this paper by Payal and Nikhil again is specifically talking about caste prejudices and infection, and these two papers are something you can refer to if this topic interests you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aditi, for that presentation. So I'll move on to our next presenter. So joining us now is Dr. Prashant Tambe. He is a social activist and an independent researcher. He recently earned his PhD in economics from RTM Nagpur University in Maharashtra. He's a freelance researcher and presently working on social diversity and inclusion at workplace projects. His research includes economics of caste, the intersectionality of caste and natural resources, diversity, and inclusion. So with that, I'll hand it over to Prashant to take us through this presentation.
Thank you, Mishi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So at the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. And with due permission from the organizer, I would like to dedicate this presentation to Dr. Gail Onwit, who passed away this morning. She was an activist, anti-caste activist, a scholar of high integrity. And she was the one actually who raised this issue of, caste and intersectionality, and environmentalism. So friends, the focus of this research is the act popularly known as Forest Right Act. So this act was introduced in 2008. Now this act was introduced to regularize such forest land that was under cultivation prior to 2005. Now the act looks very historical, because as it was to grant legal entitlement to forest land to forest dwellers. However, this act actually made it compulsory for scheduled caste forest dwellers to produce evidence of 75 years of their regular residence in the village. However, and there is no such condition for scheduled tribe forest dwellers. Now, what is the field level manifestation of these two different evidentiary biases? Let's look at it. Next, please. Now, informal exclusion and discrimination is not new to scheduled castes. However, laws and acts and policies which are formal, if they start, excluding or unfavorably including scheduled caste forest dwellers, then it could have very devastating effect on the benefits that are available to scheduled caste forest dwellers. Next, please. So it is with this background that the study tried to answer these research questions. Now, scholars like Sophia, Apita Kodevadi, and Mukul Sharma attributed such othering and unfavorable inclusion of scheduled caste forest dwellers in this act to the absence of studies on economic dependence of scheduled caste forest dwellers and social composition of forest dwellers. Friends, whenever we look at and whenever we think of forest dwelling communities, we usually think that they are tribes. Whenever we visualize forest dwelling communities, we think that they are tribes. Now, such perception, if it is carried out by the policymakers, then such laws which are exclusionary to the scheduled caste forest dwellers are passed. Next, please. So this study was conducted with 220 households from scheduled caste and scheduled tribe forest dwellers from Chandrapur district of Maharashtra. Key informant interviews and focus group discussions were conducted. Next, please. So unlike this misconception that scheduled castes are outsider to forest and scheduled tribes are the original inhabitant of forest, Ambedkar in his very famous study, Who Were Shudras, proved that at one point of time in history, both scheduled caste and scheduled tribe were nomadic tribes. And then scholars like Vasan, Kodiveri, and Sharma proved that as scheduled caste forest dwellers do not have access to land and cattle, they depend more on forest. So unlike this misconception that only tribes they depend and their dependence on forest is more, so with no access to income generating assets, scheduled caste forest dwellers they depend more on forest. When Mukul Sharma terms such exclusion of scheduled caste forest dwellers in FRA as environmental blindness, Asavari Sharma in her study on implementation of FRA, that is Forest Right Act in 4 states, proved that rejection rate of claims made by scheduled caste forest dweller is almost double when compared to scheduled caste forest dwellers. Next, please. Now, due to shortage of time, I will pick up only 2 points from this slide. So a tree known as Madhuka longifolia, locally known as Mahua tree, so forest dwellers, they collect its fruits in March. But prior to that, in February, the collection starts from March. However, forest dwellers start identifying the tree from February itself. So only that forest dwelling household would be collecting fruits from that particular forest tree. So forest dwellers, they would go and identify such trees in advance, and only that particular forest dwelling household would be allowed to collect fruits. However, this system of pre-identifying the tree is allowed only for scheduled tribe forest dwellers. Scheduled caste forest dwellers cannot do that. So their caste determines access to forest resources as well. Secondly, various works of forest maintenance, like demarcation of forest fire lines or plantation, is primarily given to tribal forest workers union. Now, as the name suggests, only tribal forest dwellers can become, member of such forest unions, and scheduled caste forest dwellers are deprived or excluded from any work. Next, please.
So Prashant has only about 30 seconds left. So if you could just wrap up.
Okay, please. So the field level manifestation of evidentiary biases can be seen on the claims that only 1% scheduled caste forest dwellers were accepted. Claims of only 1% scheduled caste forest dwellers were accepted as against the 68% for scheduled tribe. Similarly, funds received from government are first spent on scheduled tribe hamlets and not on scheduled caste forest dwellers hamlet. even the fines that are collected. So scheduled caste forest dwellers are made, it is compulsory for them to participate in forest protection committees. But when the funds collected and the fine collected from households who violate these forest protection rules, those funds are primarily used and spent on scheduled tribe forest dwellers only. Similarly, scheduled caste forest dwellers are the government department working for this welfare do not have any representation on FRA related committees. So only there is no mandatory representation of scheduled caste forest dwellers on those committees. So one can imagine the status of scheduled caste forest dwellers in those socially hierarchical villages, whether their claims will be accepted or not. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Prashant, for that presentation and on this interesting topic of FRA regulations as they pertain to these two communities. So with that, I'll now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Anaga Ingole. She is the Assistant Professor for the Department of Political Science at the University of Hyderabad. She has a PhD from JNU New Delhi and has been a Fulbright postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia. She has previously worked with the research department of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Research and Training Institute in Pune, where she led projects and trained young researchers for the Department of Social Justice and Special Assistance at the government of Maharashtra. So with that, I'll hand it over to Anaga to take us through this presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Urvashi. So I'll speak, we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so I'll speak about a short study done in 2014 and 15 among the Pune Municipal Corporation workers. The context of the study really was the socio-economic census of 2011, which pointed out that the state of Maharashtra had the highest number of manual scavengers. This got the Department of Social Justice interested into looking at the question of manual scavenging. However, if one looked closely at the terms of defining or identifying manual scavengers, it was restricted to dry lattering cleaners. Therefore, the question that I really entered into into this study. So there were two main questions. First was, is there no manual scavenging that happens in India outside dry lattering cleaning? And the second, and if yes, how does one identify it? And if this happens, what is the relationship of these so-called white-listed cleaning occupations to the caste-based occupations of cleaning? So these were the two main questions with which I entered the study. So the definitional problem that is moving away from the mode of direct contact to human waste to the fact of direct contact with human and biomedical waste was thought to be necessary, since much of the efforts of eradication of the practice of manual scavenging in India focuses on building more toilets, right? So if so the idea is that if we remove dry toilets and we move to wet toilets, the problem of manual scavenging somehow will get resolved. The Swachh Bharat Abhiyan is a flagship program for these kind of approaches. So the study really was targeting that kind of understanding of what manual scavenging is. And the study took the definition adopted by the 2013 Act, which is called the Prohibition of Employment as Manual Scavengers and Rehabilitation Act, as the baseline definition. So we took the government's own definition of what manual scavenging is to sort of look at whether manual scavenging practices occur in civic municipalities. Yeah, we can move to the next slide. In terms of method and definition, we designed a pilot study to identify other possible sites where such work takes place. The civic municipalities where cleaning work takes place was an obvious site of curiosity because, as I said, it whitelists the cleaning occupations and is to some extent still organized, falls under direct control of the government, etc. And we chose the PMC because it prides itself as being the third best civic municipality in India, and it has an organized Safai Karmachari union, etc. So the municipal cleaning staff was divided into three categories, and we looked at 491 sewage cleaners and 600 toilet cleaners. And we organize workshops for them to educate them about their rights under the 2013 Act. And we interviewed them, each one of them, at their working site. So the survey was conducted in 2015, and it was conducted under 5 research officers of the Department of Social Justice, under 20 trained field investigators. Yeah, next slide, please. So I'll share 2 main findings from the study. The first one is related to the incidence of manual scavenging among Safai Karmacharis of the PMC. So in terms of numbers, we found that 84% of sewage workers stated that they come into direct contact with human waste during the course of their work. 31% stated that they have cleaned manual waste with bare hands, and 90% used basic equipments to clean human waste, which makes all of them fall under the definition, the legal definition of manual scavengers. In what was a categorical violation of the Act, 94% of sewage workers had never received any form of training or information about their rights while doing this work.
Anagha, you have 30 seconds to wrap up.
All right. And the numbers were as stark in terms of toilet cleaners. We can go on to the next slide. In terms of the caste incidence, also, we saw that there's something called the Varsa Hakka, or the hereditary right, a system under which these workers have the right to inherit the occupation of their parents, if they are toilet cleaners or sewage workers. And there's no demand for equality merit-based recruitment here. And we found that amongst the total sample of sewage workers, 55% were appointed in their parents' place, and 78% of sewage workers had come into the occupation through this hereditary system of recruitment. So I think the 2 biggest takeaways for us was that the biggest employer under whom manual scavenging occurs under these other labels are government agencies, which benefit and often reinforce the caste-based allocation of manual scavenging work to particular groups of castes. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anagha, for your presentation. So with this, I'll introduce our next speaker, Namita Sadanand, who's a policy and training manager at JPAL South Asia. She, as a part of the policy team, leads the education sector and supports the health sector on project development for new evaluations, synthesis, and dissemination of existing evidence. And alongside that, she also works on building M&E capacity among NGOs, government, and local researchers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Namita to take us through our next presentation.
Great, thanks, Urvashi. So I'm going to switch tracks a little bit and talk about discrimination and educational outcomes. I'm going to focus on a study by JPAL affiliated researcher Peter Bergman and his colleague Isaac McFarlane. And I'll also quickly wrap up with a snapshot of related literature, which identifies and looks at mitigating discrimination in educational outcomes. Next slide, please. Okay. So the key question that the researchers wanted to answer was, do schools in the United States discriminate against students who are perceived to be difficult to educate? And how can this be measured? So just to set context here, as many of you may know, many school districts in the United States offer some form of school choice, where parents fill out applications and rank schools as based on the schools they would like to send their ward to. And in this system, students can apply to attend schools outside of their immediate neighborhoods within a district. So within these processes, there have been some institutionalized mechanisms to prevent schools from cherry picking students who they prefer. So mechanisms such as fair lotteries and common applications for all schools and parents have been instituted. However, there is still a margin where schools could still potentially influence who applies to their schools in the first place. Next point, please. So one key question which the researchers wanted to look at in this context is whether schools limit applications from students who they perceive to be harder to educate by providing them less information about the application process. Another key question here is, how can this even be measured? Because it's quite difficult to disentangle parental preferences from schools cherry picking students. So this was also a key question in this study. So to do this, the researchers actually used an innovative method. What they did was they sent fictitious emails posing as parents of children to 6,452 chartered and public schools within a sample in the United States. So what they did was they asked simple questions about the eligibility process, but in their sample, they randomly assigned whether emails indicated the following. So an email could indicate a special need, prior behavioral incidents, low prior academic achievement, and they also varied implied race, household structure, and gender of the student. So as you can see on the right-hand side here, I've just provided a snapshot of what these emails look like. In the first email, they imply that the race is Hispanic. In the second email, along with this race connotation, they also indicate that the student has special needs and will require accommodation. So what the researchers find is that schools are actually less likely to respond to inquiries from students with poor behavior, low achievement, or a special need. So they find that while response rates are actually similar between public schools and charter schools, I wanted to highlight a specific subset of findings, which indicated that charter schools were actually 6 percentage points less likely to respond to emails which signaled a significant special need. Interestingly, and more importantly, what the researchers also find is that within states where states provided partial or full reimbursements to districts for the cost of serving special needs students, they actually found no differential response rates to messages signaling special needs. So what does this mean in terms of policy implications? Next point, please. So researchers note that if barriers to information could translate into differential access to high quality schools, which it does seem to in this case, this practice could actually be exacerbating existing educational disparities. They also find that policies that reimburse schools for their special education costs can actually eliminate charter schools' incentive to discourage applications from students with special needs. So I'm going to now briefly highlight a couple of other studies by JPAL affiliated researchers, which look at identifying and mitigating discrimination within education. So the first paper by Rimahana and Leland is set within India and looks at whether teachers discriminate against students from lower castes in terms of test scores. In terms of mitigating discrimination, a couple of interesting studies. So one is by Alberto Alicina and colleagues, where in Italy, they look at whether providing evidence of implicit bias to teachers can change the way they view immigrant students in their classrooms. The next study is by Shule Allen and colleagues, where they test the impact of an intervention which encourages perspective taking, and they look at whether this improves social cohesion between Turkish students as well as children from Syrian refugee families. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Namita. So now I'll introduce the next speaker, Vidita Priyadarshini, who is a Senior Policy and Communications Associate at JPAL South Asia, where she assists in the efforts to promote evidence-informed policy making in the region. As part of the policy team, she works on the labor markets and firm sectors and also supports outreach for JPAL South Asia's institutional partnership with the government of Punjab. And additionally, as part of the communications team, she works on supporting the execution of JPAL South Asia's external outreach and communication strategy. So I'll hand it over to Vidita to present the next study.
Thanks, Urvashi. So hi, everyone. Today I'll be talking about one study that looks at hiring discrimination among skilled immigrants to the Canadian labor market. Next slide, please. So this study is by JPAL affiliated Professor Philip Oriopoulos, and it was conducted in 2008 and 9. The motivation is to understand whether skilled immigrants face statistical discrimination in the Canadian labor market and what factors contribute to this discrimination. So to define statistical discrimination, the idea is if employers discriminate against individuals in the absence of some specific information using generalizations, perceived generalizations about particular groups. So the context here is Canada uses this point-based skilled immigration program, which sort of seeks to evaluate applicants on various parameters and attract a highly skilled workforce in different sort of sectors that they might not locally find skilled workers for. However, unemployment rates among immigrants remain very high compared to non-immigrants at the time of the study. So it was almost double the rate of unemployment seen in non-immigrants, and wage levels were also quite low compared to non-immigrants at about 36% lower. So the paper seeks to understand how employers make these decisions about initial interview callback to different candidates. So it also uses a similar methodology to the paper that the previous speaker just presented. It's an audit study that sends fictitious resumes to employers varying different features that might potentially affect their decision. So in this case, the researcher created a set of about 13,000 fictitious resumes using real-world resumes with sort of altering some factors, and it was sent in response to around 3,000 job postings in 2 major cities. So the features that are varied, so the base is a type 0 resume, which is an English-sounding name, Canadian education, and Canadian work experience. And then they add features such as foreign-sounding names from 3 major origin countries of immigration, which is India, Pakistan, and China. The second one is foreign education, having some mixed work experience locally in Canada or abroad, and then entirely foreign work experience. About half of these resumes were also randomly selected to include other information like language skills, whether you have education from a prestigious university or experience from a respected firm, and whether you have a master's degree from Canada. Next slide, please. So the main results find that there was evidence of substantial discrimination against applicants with foreign names. So the main finding here is that changing only the name on a resume from an English-sounding name to one of other origins decreased the likelihood of a callback for an interview by 4.4 percentage points. And while sort of Canadian education didn't seem to matter to employers in this study, having local job experience in the country had a substantial premium. So for all of these resumes from types 2 to 4, there was a higher callback rates, particularly for ones with having full Canadian work experience only by 5.1 percentage points. Thirdly, listing local references, listing the fact that you might have a permanent residency status, indicating that they're able to work easily in that country, or even having Canadian accreditation for additional diplomas and skills training certificates did not change the likelihood that the callback rate would improve. And lastly, even for things such as unobservable characteristics, right? So if a general resume does not indicate whether you have language skills, soft skills, or communication skills that might be more valuable in certain types of jobs, or even indicating that you're from a prestigious university, did not improve the callback rates for foreign named applicants. So here the researchers also did like a short qualitative survey with recruiters, which sort of confirmed this finding that there is an emphasis on the language barrier and the soft skills barrier. But the presence of this information explicitly in a resume also did not seem to offset these concerns. So overall, these results sort of raise the question that the empirical evidence doesn't exactly corroborate that there was statistical discrimination taking place, and points to the fact that there may be more implicit sort of prejudices at play. Next section, please. So in terms of policy implications, one suggestion that comes out of this set of results is that employers could consider masking names in the initial decision-making process itself, right? And the idea is to at least make it possible for people to get their foot in the door. The second sort of more broader policy implication for labor market interventions is that if you're, if the policy was just to call a highly skilled workforce into the country, and they're facing these barriers, an initial job matching to work that sort of aligns with their previous experience, and the fact that there is a substantial premium to having Canadian job experience, having that initial job and assistance with that would sort of likely improve their overall outcomes. And the last one would be that hiring policies overall could consider how to assess the presence of language skills, and overall the immigration system could also consider more heavily weighing the importance of language skills that a person might bring with them. So next slide, please. So in terms of related literature on these two themes, the researcher, along with 2 other researchers, did a follow-up study supplementing this field experiment data with some administrative data to check whether employer size matters in the level of discrimination that different types of immigrants might face. In terms of mitigating hiring discrimination, so as you can see, one of the recommendations was to consider masking names or other identifiers that might trigger discriminatory response. So in France, they studied the effects of anonymizing resumes. And another study looks at removing the question asking for criminal conviction records or incarceration from employer application sites. So I'll end here and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Vidita. So we're now going to move into the next section. So far, we've sort of seen a lot of presentations around identifying biases and prejudice, either in government programs or policies, as well as some ways researchers have measured discrimination or tested discrimination through these techniques in education and labor markets. The next set of presentations will focus on interventions that can be done to mitigate discrimination and prejudice. So the first presenter on this topic is going to be Rashni Sinha, who's a policy manager at JPAL South Asia, where she leads the finance as well as crime, violence, and conflict sector. In her current role, she works to cultivate partnerships with governments, financial institutions, and researchers in the South Asia region to ensure that policies are driven by evidence. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rashni to take us to the next study.
Thanks, Urvashi, and thank you for setting the context for the next section. So good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'll discuss a recent paper by Matt Lowe, a JPAL affiliated researcher, examining the impact of social contact among members belonging to different castes in Varanasi in UP. Next slide, please. So contact between members of different social groups is said to have the potential to reduce prejudice, and this is called intergroup of social contact. And while integration through such contact is seen as a natural policy response, we don't have enough evidence around how effectively can contact reduce prejudice and how the type of contact matters in mediating prejudice. So one key question for research is what type of intergroup contact can actually reduce prejudice and to what extent. So this is a study that was conducted in Varanasi where caste-based segregation is prevalent in some areas. Using cricket to study the impact of members of different castes, either playing on the same cricket team, which is called collaborative contact, or in rival teams called adversarial contact to measure cross-caste prejudice and interactions. You could animate the next portion. Thanks. So as a part of the study, researchers recruited over 1,200 men across different castes to participate in 8 cricket leagues across 8 gram panchayats in the year 2017. So these men were first randomly either assigned to play in the leagues or to serve as a control group. Of the 800 men who were assigned to the cricket leagues, in each cricket league, which roughly had 100 people, 35% were assigned to homogeneous caste teams, which is essentially that all the players belong to the same caste. And the other remaining 65% were assigned to mixed caste teams, where players were from different castes. The teams were then randomly assigned to play against opponents. So surveyors here recorded the players' interactions at every match, observing the kind of interactions they had while playing closely with each other. And after each league ended, the participants' prejudice and interactions were measured along 3 main areas. So the first is the researchers asked the participants about their willingness to interact with players of different castes, as well as the kind of cross-caste friendships they were able to form. Second, the researchers measured the participants' favoritism for members of their own caste by asking these participants to anonymously vote for one member of each team who they nominate to receive professional cricket coaching. So because the participants were told to vote for the player they most preferred, this voting exercise allowed the researchers to be able to look at the effect of contact on caste favoritism. So whether players are voting for others based on their caste rather than their ability. Finally, researchers also measured if the intervention had any effect on cross-caste trading. So basically, after the leagues ended, the researchers gave all participants in an exercise intentionally mismatched goods, for example, like 2 left-hand gloves, and gave them small monetary incentives to be able to successfully trade that with another participant to correct the mismatch. Then researchers also topped that out by placing colored stickers on each of the mismatched pairs that correlated strongly with the recipient's caste, and offered about half of the participants extra money for trading an object with a differently colored sticker, which, like I mentioned, correlated very strongly with the caste of the recipient. So this allowed the researchers to see whether the collaborative versus adversarial contact from the matches was able to affect the likelihood of players trading with each other, and what happens if there are stronger monetary incentives at play. Next slide, please. So let's discuss the results. So researchers basically found that collaborative contact increased cross-caste interactions significantly by 31%, as well as friendships by around the same amount, while adversarial contact had the opposite effect and reduced overall cross-caste interactions as well as friendships. In terms of when we look at caste favoritism, we find that collaborative contact actually decreased favoritism in the voting exercise by roughly a third compared to other players. And finally, when we look at the cross-trade incentive exercise that we had created, the league participation under either type of contact increased the quantity of cross-caste trade, but in the color switching exercise, collaborative contact increased cross-caste trade by a significantly higher percentage, which basically suggests that collaborative contact can facilitate economic integration if there are additional monetary incentives at play. So essentially, in terms of policy implications, these results suggest that short-term sports programs can be sort of particularly effective in strengthening cooperation and reducing prejudice. And intergroup interventions, most importantly, can be effective when the integration takes place in small groups with common goals. For example, like in this study where cricket players were working together in the same team towards working towards the common goal of winning. So next slide, please. So these are the results of the study and possible implications. And if you're interested in learning more about the impact of intergroup contact in different contexts, we would recommend some of these other papers by JPAL affiliated researchers. The first of these papers looked at whether intergroup contact can foster cross-group cooperation in post-conflict communities between Christian and Muslims in post-conflict Iraq. The second and fourth study on the slide that you can see looked at the impact of intergroup interactions where students were assigned to roommates of a different race and how that impacted pro-social behavior and whether that promoted positive attitudes and behaviors. And the third study basically provides evidence on whether religiously diverse neighbors change attitudes about another religious group if they are made to live with each other. So that's it. Thanks, Urvashi. Back to you.
Thank you, Rashni. So our next presenter is Moshri Mohan, who's the Policy and Training Manager at JPAL South Asia, where she works on the Cash Transfers for Child Health Initiative and also on the Boosting Immunization Demand Scale-Up. In her work, she analyzes, synthesizes, and disseminates JPAL affiliates research, working closely with government and other stakeholders in order to turn evidence into policy and building monitoring and evaluation capacity in the region. So that I'll hand over to Moshri to go through the next presentation.
Thanks, Urvashi. So hi, everyone. Today I'll be talking about a study that looks at physician workforce diversity and whether that increases uptake of preventive care in the context of the US. So it's a paper by JPAL affiliate Marcela Alsan and her colleagues. Next slide, please. All right. So the motivating question that drove this study was, does physician workforce diversity, specifically having more African-American physicians in the workforce, increase the demand for preventive care among Black men in the USA? And the reason this is important is because African-American men have the lowest life expectancy of any major demographic group in the US. Much of this is driven by chronic diseases, which are amenable to primary or secondary prevention. And that in turn is driven by underutilized preventive healthcare services. So one solution that then comes up is to diversify the healthcare profession. 13% of people, 13% of the US population is Black, but only 4% of the health workforce is made up by Black people. So in order to study this question, the researchers recruited 1,300 Black men in the Bay Area, of which 637 completed the study. These participants who were recruited were provided coupons for free health screenings, which could be redeemed at a clinic that the researchers had set up with 14 Black and non-Black male doctors. So the participants who visited the clinic at the point of the visit were randomly assigned to see either a Black or a non-Black doctor. And in order to further study the question of uptake of preventive healthcare, they were also assigned to receive incentives or no incentives for the flu vaccine. So prior to meeting the doctors, the participants sat in a room and they saw the name and headshot of their doctor on a tablet, and they were also asked to fill out a questionnaire asking which, if any, of 4 cardiovascular screening services they would like to receive. So these were BMI measurement, blood pressure measurement, diabetes screening, and cholesterol screening. So please note that diabetes and cholesterol screening involve a finger prick test. So they are slightly more invasive than the prior 2 measurements, and participants were made aware of this. They were also asked whether they wanted to receive a flu shot administered by the assigned doctor. And for those who were given incentives, the incentive amount was also listed. So that's what they had to do prior to the consultation. Then after they met the doctor, and the doctor was only supposed to provide information, no other treatment or prognosis, just information on the value of preventive healthcare services. After they met the doctor, subjects could revise their choice of preventive care. And after this, the doctor administered the selected services. So the key outcome that the researchers were really looking at was the change in demand for preventive services before and after the consultation. So what they found, as they predicted, was that subjects were much more likely to select every preventive service, particularly the invasive services I described earlier, once they met with a doctor who was of the same race as them. So before the consultation, subjects were equally likely to pick the same number of preventive services, regardless of the doctor they were assigned to. But after meeting the doctor, the subjects who were assigned to the Black doctors were actually 18 percentage points more likely to take up preventives, and this effect was even larger for the invasive services. A related result was that financial incentives increased the flu shot take-up, but actually 26% of the people who refused the flu shot when they were offered it, regardless of the incentives, were actually persuaded by Black doctors to take it up after they met them. So the researchers did some more digging, and the sort of driving mechanism is better communication between Black participants and Black doctors, which explains these results. So what are the implications that these findings have for policy? So there's actually a very large gap between Black and white men in cardiovascular mortality in the US. And just quick back of the envelope calculation suggested that Black doctors could reduce this gap by 19%. But it's important to note that a more diverse physician workforce might be necessary to realize these gains. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So just a quick overview of some more studies that are looking at identifying and mitigating discrimination within healthcare. So there was a recent working paper put out by JPAL affiliate Pascaline Dupas and her colleague Radhika Jain, looking at gender disparities in utilization of government health insurance in India, particularly in Rajasthan. So it's a really interesting paper, would encourage you to look at it. There's also been a follow-up study by Marcella and her colleagues on a similar topic of whether physician-delivered COVID-19 public health messages and messages acknowledging racial inequality affect Black and white adults' beliefs, knowledge, and practices related to COVID-19. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mulshri. So our next presenter is Dr. Vikraj Gerard, who's a researcher at the Nova School of Business and Economics, and a research affiliate at the Orleans University and a lecturer at Nova SPE and BRGM. She holds a PhD in economics from Paris 1 Pantheon Sorbonne and held visiting positions in Brown University and the University of Geneva. And her research is in development economics and political economy. I'll just switch slides just 1 second. So hopefully all of you can see my screen now. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, it is.
So over to
I don't know if you can go Control-L so that it's full screen.
Let me just try again.
Otherwise, we can go back. We can go back to the other ones as you prefer.
So we can use this. So you can go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for the organizers and everyone, and also for the last-minute changing slides. So I will be presenting on the role of quotas and how they may mitigate discrimination. Next, please. Where quotas, electoral quotas, are a very widespread form of affirmative action aiming at reducing entrance discrimination. They are useful in that they allow to change visibly and immediately an outcome of interest, but they are also debated in that members of the majority group may feel treated unfairly by these quotas. Next, please. I'll focus here on the case of caste quotas for pradhans in local elections in India, which is a very large-scale policy, which, as almost all affirmative action policy, has the objective of coming to an end, that at the moment that a non-discriminatory equilibrium is reached, it can be repealed. To reach this non-discriminatory equilibrium, we would ideally like to be in a case where these quotas have allowed better redistribution of resources, which is the topic of the next presentation, and also a change in the social norms and the perception of the different social groups. And we hear no little about how do people, constituents, and in particular the members of the majority groups react to this electoral quota. So that's what I will be focusing on, looking at whether political quotas for members of the scheduled caste reduce caste-based discrimination. Next, please. I will make use of the following question, which asked in the RUD 2006, to which respondent whether them or a member of the family have been prevented from entering any street within their village because of their caste. And the question is asked both for the time of the survey and retrospectively 10 years before. Next, please. I argue that this question is a great proxy of caste-based discrimination. There's no question of statistical discrimination here. It's also key for equality of opportunity at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And while I wouldn't take the answer of each individual household at a given point in time as an accurate measure of the exact level of discrimination this household faces, what's interesting is the variation in the answer of this household compared to the answers of other households. For a rough overview, focusing on the states of the Hindi belts, as I will do in the rest of the presentation, we can see that in 1996, it's actually 65% of the members of the scheduled caste that declare that have been excluded from some streets based on their caste. In 2006, this proportion had dropped to 44%, which is still quite high. The question, next please, is to which extent do caste-based electoral quotas play a part in affecting the caste-based street exclusion? Caste-based electoral quota provide an ideal natural quasi-experiment with variation in time, place, and also caste. So here, the identifying variation in my work comes from the fact that the scheduled caste quotas have a heterogeneous effect on scheduled caste households compared to households of other castes. Next, please. The main result, if I show it here in a descriptive format, focusing on the sample of scheduled caste household, is that quotas do reduce caste-based discrimination. So here on the left panel, you have street exclusions reported in 1996. And we can see that quotas in 1990, respondents in villages that had a quota in 1996, that is the middle bar of the left panel, declare significantly less street exclusion. If we move to the right panel, it's only respondents in villages that had a C quota in 2006 that report significantly less street exclusion. If we estimate this in a triple difference framework for a more causal effect, back please. If we estimate this in a triple difference framework, we observe that SC quotas decrease caste-based street exclusion by about 10 percentage points for members of the SC. And the effect is transitory. So what I argue is that this effect comes from a change in the social norm, what is acceptable to do publicly, but not necessarily a change in entrenched prejudices, how you deeply, intimately think about each other, which might require a repetition of quotas or other forms of intervention. Let me quickly close, next please, by calling on further research on the question of intersectionality. A side result in this paper, which is descriptive, there's no causality here, is that SC Pradhan elected outside SC quota may actually worsen the exclusion of scheduled caste households. I was super puzzled at this result at first sight, but then I realized that out of 19 Pradhans, SC Pradhans in the sample elected outside SC quota, 15 are elected on gender quotas, which poses the question of what is happening there. Is it a question of backlash post the caste contest for the seats, because the gender seats have no caste reservation? Is it that quotas work as a priming of one or another identity, or a combination of struggles or lack of social capitals? There's so many things to be done on this topic. Many thanks for your attention. We have a last slide with a few links on all these topics, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Victor, and for this very interesting study and the results from it. So we're going to now move on to our last presenter, Dr. Nicholas Haas. Nicholas is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Aarhus University. He received his PhD from the Political Science Department at New York University in 2020, and his research investigates causes, consequences, and potential solutions to intergroup inequality, polarization, and conflict, with a particular focus on efforts to improve access to justice for marginalized populations in weak states. So I'll hand it over to Nicholas now to take us to the next presentation.
Great, thank you, and I'm happy to be part of this panel. I've already learned quite a bit. And so I'll be presenting a paper, Does Political Affirmative Action Work and for Whom? Theory and Evidence on India's Scheduled Areas. And it is joint with Saad Gulzar and Benjamin Pasquale. Next slide, please. So I'll start with the research question and motivation, which begins with a recognition that in over 100 countries, there have been electoral quotas that were implemented with the aim of raising the voice of marginalized communities and how governments function. And these have often been very controversial policies. India is certainly not an exception to that. It's been very controversial in India as well. And so what we try to do in this paper is we try to engage with two central arguments that critics have made against political affirmative action. One of those arguments is that it damages a meritocratic system. And if you have reservations in place, they will empower less competent individuals, and therefore you will hurt overall development and other outcomes because the people in power will be less competent. And the second main argument that we've seen is that to the extent that a targeted minority group benefits from a quota, gains for that group will primarily come at the cost of other vulnerable groups with whom they are in economic competition, and not from more powerful segments in society, which quotas are designed to shift power away from. So it will just hurt a different vulnerable community. And we think it's really important to engage with these criticisms, in particular in contexts like India and many other countries where poor populations are very reliant on government welfare programs. So you could imagine a worst case scenario where quotas even prove self-defeating in that they damage the economic prospects of those they aim to politically empower, right? So if you have a situation where many people depend on government programs and there are less competent people in power and the implementation of those programs suffers, then maybe economic prospects will suffer will decline for vulnerable communities. Next point, please. And so in this paper, we try to answer two questions. First, do electoral quotas improve or hinder overall development? And second, how are the benefits and costs of quotas distributed in society? Next slide, please. And what we do is we look at the scheduled areas quota. Scheduled areas cover a population of over 100 million citizens across 9 states. And beginning in 1996, with the PESA Act, all chairperson positions at all 3 levels of local government and 50% of all seats on these councils were reserved for scheduled tribes or ST individuals. And here you can see our sample. Next point, please. What we do is we look at the effects of this quota on NREGA, the world's largest public employment program, which guarantees 100 days of minimum wage employment. And we look at overall outcomes and critically outcomes across groups. So we compare outcomes for ST with outcomes for another historically disadvantaged community, scheduled caste, SC, as well as a residual non-SC, ST category. And we look at work days in 2013. Next point, please. What we do is we try to approximate an experiment where essentially villages were assigned randomly, of course this is not the case, to either receive the quota or not receive the quota. And so what we do is we compare villages just on one side of the quota boundary with villages just on the other side. And what we do, and we unpack this in the paper, is we argue that on most observables and unobservables, these villages are very similar. And the main difference here that we attribute to differences in outcomes is the presence of the quota or not. Next slide, please. So key findings. First, we find that NREGA delivery improves for targeted minorities who receive 24% more workdays in scheduled areas as compared with non-scheduled areas. And contrary to the expectations of critics, these gains do not come at the cost of another vulnerable community, the SC community, but rather at the cost of the non-SC ST community, who receive 11.5% fewer workdays. Also, contrary to critics' claims, we do not find that quota politicians overall are less competent. So overall delivery is no worse in scheduled areas than non-scheduled areas. And another complaint that you see sometimes is that it will, these types of quotas will unfairly favor the targeted community. But to the contrary, if you look at population shares in scheduled areas and non-scheduled areas, what we find is that if anything, it improves correspondence. So we see that yes, the targeted community does better, but if anything, it just seems to be more fair if you look at population shares. Next slide, please. So very quickly, we do quite a few tests to try and be sure that electoral quotas are A, responsible for improved outcomes, and B, that poor communities really benefit from these improved outcomes. One thing we look at is the effects on a different different program, PMGSY, which builds roads connecting to rural villages. And we can see that really only following elections do scheduled areas tend to do better. We also look at effects on broader public goods, and we see that public goods provision really improves in areas that benefit poor communities. So these findings seem to be in line with our claims. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, in the paper, we argue that political affirmative action and development programs should be viewed as complementary levers to improve outcomes for marginalized communities. And one question that we think is an interesting one that we don't investigate in this paper is we look at effects of a quota 12 years out from the first elections. But this is a fixed political affirmative action program. So these are non-rotating quotas, which is relatively unique in many contexts and in the Indian contexts. And one criticism you could have is that in the long run, maybe this will just create an equally unequal structure, just with a new group on top. And so it would be interesting to look at some of these longer term effects. And so here, I've included some information on how you may contact myself or my co-authors on this piece. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for your presentation. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. I think there are some questions in the Q&A box, so I'll address those to the speakers that they address to. But in the meantime, in case anybody has any further questions, please do add them to the Q&A box or to the chat. So to start out with, we have one question for Deepthi. So Deepthi, is there evidence of internalized discrimination along other identities as well, like gender, in the study or other studies that you may know of?
Yeah, so using the same data and the same technique, we see whether there is evidence of, women self-employed businesses reporting lower amounts as being remunerative, and we find that it is the case. And apart from our work, there's a lot of literature. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the phrase depressed entitlement was coined in the context of women, and there's a lot of work. Nothing comes on top of my mind right now, but there are references in our paper which talk about how women have internalized discrimination, and they say they're happy for less for the same kind of work that they do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Diti, for answering that question. I think for Anaga, there was a question for you about how did the Pune Municipal Corporation and other government stakeholders respond to the results of the study, and what did they do anything to kind of address that, or incorporate lessons from the study into their work?
Yeah, it's interesting that when we were doing the study, when we began doing the study, we got a really positive response from the Pune Municipal Corporation, also because we were working with the department, which was a government department, and it was a hierarchy. So a state department was sort of accessing information from a municipal corporation. But when we finally published a report and we submitted it to both the state government and the PMC acknowledged it, but they didn't say anything about it, and neither did the state government. So yeah, so then I had to just sort of make a summary and publish it in the EPW. That's where the paper came out, but nothing happened about the report.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think while the papers are definitely published, I think getting actual change to happen is sort of course, much harder. Okay, I think there are a couple of questions for Aditi, and I see that she's joined back in. Aditi, can you hear us?
Hello, yes, hi.
Great. So Aditi, there were a few questions for you from the participants. So the first one was they're curious to know what's the response of hospital authorities when the lack of cleanliness was brought up. And then secondly, another question was about whether the study was in the context of private or public hospitals. And what are your thoughts on the policy implications of your work when it comes to health administration? And then they also mentioned that it would be great to hear more about the work of Bahujan economists overall. So yeah, multiple questions for you, but please go ahead and you can address them in any order.
Right, okay. So I will club the first three questions and tell you from the field experience that, so basically this was done, the fieldwork primarily comprised of going to public hospitals. So the finding that I shared with you are from public hospitals. And in fact, some of them were large district hospitals in Bihar and other North Indian states. And talking about the response of the admin, from what I know, the quotes that are presented in the slides were from,
So your voice,
after spending a lot of time.
So your voice just went out. If you could just repeat the last sentence.
Yeah, I was saying that it was the study comprised of interviews, but a lot of time was also spent in making observation at the hospital. So for example, when there was a delivery, doctors would come and deliver the baby, but afterwards, even if it's suppose a very busy day, the dirt on the delivery table, the blood, etc. would stay there, and unless cleaning staff comes in to clean these things, the dirt is supposed to stay because no one else is coming to clean it. So this was overall the observation, and the responses that we got from the staff at higher level also was presented during the presentation. Sorry, what was the other question? I think I missed it.
So the second question was whether the study was done in private or public hospitals, and then also what your thoughts are on sort of the policy implications of the work.
Right, yeah. So I think I've answered the second one because this involved largely going to public hospitals and also the district hospitals. About policy implications, see, a lot of this is happening because, be it a private or a public hospital, when they hire the sweeper and the worker, they hire from the local villages on contract basis. A lot of these workers are not regulated; they're not given any facility, and and they don't have rights. So in order to get adequate, to receive adequate training or to receive the protective gear, they don't know who to ask for. Even if there's a regulation, they simply don't, because the way public infrastructure is working in India is just replicating the basic caste-based society that we have. So one of the policy implications that I can think of is that there should be a regulation when they're hiring the worker. First of all, that will provide them with some rights. And these guidelines should be made very clear that there are certain norms that should be followed in the hospital. First, and I do think I have a very ready answer for this, but I'm assuming and imagining that a lot of this will happen only if the issue of these practices being, caste-based is recognized, and then the policy, then the plans are made around how to do away with these. About DE, yes, Ocean Economics, we started it last year. We are going to have, we are going to complete a year in September, and this is meant for students and aspiring economists from marginalized communities. And so we share whatever resources we have, and there are people like senior faculty members and PhD students who share resources. They conduct classes for our students, and we're just trying to help each other improve our representation and also give voices to the perspective of Bahujan aspirants in economics, which has largely been missing until now. So yeah, I hope I answered the questions.
Thank you so much, Aditi, for those responses. So I think there's a few additional questions for both Dr. Haas and Dr. Gerard. So given your expertise in research on social identity and conflict more broadly, what are some new questions you think would be critical to explore within this area? Given the stickiness of norms, these seem to be particularly challenging to address. So maybe you can go like one by one. So maybe Vikraj first and then Nicholas.
Thanks for the question. It's very interesting and broad. I guess here I have to answer with my personal interest. I feel there's two particular aspects that are interesting. One, maybe related more to conflict and violence, which is the question of backlash, the risk of backlash around the implementation of affirmative action. And any change in norms, you're going to go against the view of a part of the population, how to make that work. I think there's like a lot to be done on this. There's quite a bit of evidence from lab studies. I did a little bit of work on a change in the pattern of crimes, but I think so much more has to be done, and also about the tailoring of the programs. One thing is to tell the existing programs to say lead to a backlash, and also is how do you tailor the program? How do you, is it a question of information? Is it a question of how it is designed? Is it a hard quota? All of this. So I think there's like a huge amount. And the second would be what I was trying to open the presentation on, and that I think is a big topic in this conference, which is the question of intersectionality. How do you take in account, if you want to try to change some norms, the existence of overlapping identities? And there again is a lot to be done. I'm happy to talk further about it. I think Nicola will have also a lot to say.
So I think those are great points, and some that I was going to make as well. I guess what I would add maybe is I think one big question is how to, we saw a couple presentations on positive intergroup contact, and I think one interesting question here is how to create settings where you can create these positive conditions for contact, and in particular, how can you scale them up, right? So we've seen a number of studies that show that you can have positive contact, but it's not clear yet really how you can do that on a really large scale, and I think that's challenging. And I guess the second point I would make here is one question that I've come across in my own work, is how much exactly do you want to involve people who are in power, who benefit from the status quo and from the status quo norms. So of course there are benefits to their inclusion, right? Because they do hold significant sway and power under the status quo. But I think you can, and this goes to the point about backlash also, you can, even if there isn't backlash, come up against a point where, how much power are people voluntarily willing to give up? And so I think that's a challenge, at least I've come across in my work, about how to engage these different groups and how to create positive settings and hopefully to do it on a larger scale.
Thank you for those responses. I think we have a few more minutes, and I don't think there are more questions, but I just had one question actually for both of you again. I think both of you mentioned that the research on sort of electoral quotas has been done in other countries as well, or maybe it's sort of affirmative action in general. So we've, of course, being in India, we've heard about a lot of the research around electoral quotas, whether it's sort of based on caste groups or women, but what is some of the other evidence around affirmative action from outside of India that we know of that may be sort of useful for people, or people might be interested in here as well?
This is again such a broad question. I guess one part of maybe one thing I would mention, but again is with room for further research, is the question of increasing representation in selection groups or in any advisory panels. So there's this increasing willingness of saying, in particular on gender quotas, that there should be gender quota of any selection committee, any grading committee, and these are great work that seem to be working, but not if it's only I need to organize here. So there's two aspects. One is about how much representation matter. I forgot the name of the authors, but you have this idea that just one woman in a committee might not be enough. You need a critical mass to actually manage to change the way the community works. The second aspect, which is maybe more about potential further work actually, is the extra burden it represents actually on the people that are supposed to benefit from this action. Because if you don't cut away all the type of services that this, in particular, women are supposed to do, this is actually and also an extra burden on them. Yeah,
thank you so much, Victoria. Nicholas, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think I'd be happy to follow up with some specific references, but I think those are very good threads of literature to look at as well.
Okay. I think there was one more question actually in the Q&A that was just posted. So I think we'll close with that as the last one. So this is for Prashant. What are some important gaps future research could address with respect to forest dwellers, particularly as environmental concerns get raised due to reliance on forest resources? So it'll be great if you can take that question and then we can close the session.
Yeah, thank you. Probably this broad understanding that only tribal communities' culture is more, for resource conservative culture is there, whereas there is not much research on whether scheduled caste communities, scheduled caste forest dwellers also have resource conservative culture. That needs to studied more. Also, I mean, my study was based on just one district. Similar different geographies can be brought under for research. And then usually there is this understanding, again, misconception that tribal communities do not discriminate on caste lines. But then my research found that even tribal communities do discriminate. And so that needs to be probed more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we're at time to close the session. Thank you so much to all the panelists for compressing all of your work into sort of a very short time frame that we allowed you. But it was great to sort of hear these very diverse and interesting, or hear about all of these diverse and interesting studies. And thank you to all the participants who joined. And I'll just hand it over to Pranati now in case any closing remarks from the Belong team.
Sure. Thank you, Urvashi, and a huge thank you to all our panelists for joining in today. It's been a great discussion. There's so much that I personally learned, and I'm sure all our attendees learned as well. And we do look forward to seeing you in the future as well. Two quick announcements from our side. The first is that we do look forward to seeing all our attendees join us in an hour, which is at 4:30 for our next panel discussion, which is on how can global WASH programs be made more inclusive, which will be moderated by Neeraj Bhatnagar, who is the founder of Belong and a partner at Dalberg. And our speakers for that include the Chief Executive for WaterAid India, the Managing Director for India Water.org, and the co-founder and executive director for Hasirudala. So we do look forward to seeing you all in the span of an hour. Alongside that, Belong to curate more such similar intersectional conversations, has also launched its short-form literary content mobile app, which focuses on diversity and inclusion for South Asian audiences. And it is now live on the Google Play Store. So we'd love for you all to check it out and to give us your feedback on that. I'll be attaching the link for that in the chat box below. I'd also like to give a shout out for tomorrow's session, which is also being co-hosted by our lovely partners at JPAL South Asia. The panel discussion is titled From Research to Action, Designing Inclusive Policies, and is being held tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. It is an hour and a half long, so we'd love for you all to join us there as well. Do keep an eye out for the schedule. Again, I'll be posting the link for that in the chat box below. Thank you so much for joining in, and see you in an hour.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.